And thank you once again for accepting our invitation to speak with us today. If you don't mind, I'll say a few words in Turkish, just to introduce you so we can begin. 75. Mekan Konuşmaları'na hoş geldiniz. Artık bu dönemin de sonuna yaklaşıyoruz. Haftaya son bir konuşmamız var. Bugün Mount Allison Coğrafya ve Çevre bölümünden Kadın ve Toplumsal Cinsiyet Çalışmaları Direktörü Leslie Kern bizlerle. Ben kendisini karantina başında ikinci kitabı Feminist Şehir yayınlandığı zaman, Sel Yayınları tarafından yayınlandığı zaman tanıdım. Kitabın ilk olarak Türkçe çevirisinin yayınlanması bana çok kıymetli geliyor. Orijinal dilinden önce Türkçe olarak yayınlanması, başka çevirileri sonra yayınlandı mı bilmiyorum ama yani bu coğrafya özelinde yazılmamasına rağmen, Kuzey Amerika özelinde yazılmasına rağmen bizi de çok ilgilendiriyor diye düşünüyorum. Kendisi şehirlerin planlanırken önemsenenin asıl erkek bedeni olduğunu ve kadın bedeninin hani şey yapıldığını, yani kadınlara özel tasarlanan mekanların sadece heteronormatif kalıpları pekiştirdiğine inanıyor. Bugün bize kitabını özetlemeyecek sadece, pandemiyi de göz önünde bulundurarak kadın bedenini önemseyen şehirler nasıl tasarlayabiliriz? Bunun üzerine düşüncelerini paylaşacak. Sözü kendisine geri bırakıyorum. Back to you. We can start sharing screen.
Hello, everyone. Lovely to be here. Thank you so much for this kind invitation and for joining me here today. I am coming to you from the small, quiet town of Sackville, New Brunswick, Canada right now. It's a snowy December day, and I thought that I would start out today by first kind of situating myself and the book a little bit before going into some of the specific ideas that I wanted to share today. I realized as I was sitting here just now thinking I should have put up the image for the cover of the Turkish translation of the book, and I realized I don't even have the link to it, but hopefully some of you have seen it or are able to easily find that for yourselves. But the translation in Turkish was actually the first translation to come out, so that's really exciting to have that out there and available for you and others. As I'm sure was conveyed in the introduction, my sort of day job is as a university professor here in Canada, and I teach as part of a geography and environment department, but my background is in women's and gender studies. So I came to thinking about cities first from a feminist perspective, from an interest in understanding how power worked in different sorts of situations, from an interest in thinking about how the intersections of sexism, racism, classism, ableism, and so on join together to shape people's lives in different ways. And it wasn't until I was in graduate school that I even learned about the field of feminist geography as an area of study that takes those questions about power and gender and identity and tries to map them onto places to understand that the places around us also play a role in shaping society. And of course, as I point out in the book, societies shape the spaces around us. They're not these neutral containers that are sort of given to us and just appear. They're very much made by people, and they reflect the power dynamics, the values, the norms, and the beliefs of the society that built those spaces. So to me, this was a really exciting way to think about these questions of power, gender, intersectionality. And from that point onwards, I gradually immersed myself in the world of feminist geographer, and that's kind of how I came to be within the field of urban geography without having sort of started out there in any way, shape, or form. So as part of my regular work, I teach in a geography department. I teach urban studies classes, and I'm a primarily research gentrification as well. So that's kind of what I do on the day-to-day. And my idea for writing this book was really just, honestly, I didn't really think that it would go anywhere or become anything. It was more of just like a hobby project. But I did think that there was maybe an interest in a different sort of take on a feminist future. There's a lot of great feminist writing out there, but I thought what maybe I could contribute was this conversation about how the cities around us might be part of that feminist future. And so I was interested in taking some of the ideas that I teach about and write about as an academic and making them more accessible to a wide audience of people, just everyday city dwellers, people who are interested in city life and people who might be interested in these questions of how power and inequality work in cities. So in order to make it accessible, the book kind of starts from everyday experience, asking questions about the things that have happened in my own life, the things that are common to many women's lives, although of course, not universal. There are lots of differences between us, but there are maybe some starting points from kind of the embodied experience of being a woman, being gendered in the city that kind of create for us a set of questions and concerns that have often been ignored in mainstream city politics and urban planning and architecture and so on. And throughout the book, I do try to take an intersectional approach to not just focus on my experience as a sort of white, cisgender, middle-class woman from from the global north, from a very privileged country and so on, but to try to think about how those privileges kind of come up against other sorts of inequality and oppression in the city as well. So as I said, coming at this from a women's studies background, I'm very much not an architect, planner, or urban designer. And yet over the last several months, I've received a lot of invitations from architecture organizations, professional organizations, graduate schools, and so on to speak about. So on the one hand, I feel like a bit of an imposter. This is who am I to tell architects and designers what to do? So I'm very honored to be invited to be part of these conversations. But of course, I don't want to tell people how to do their jobs or how to think. And I know that for many people in architecture and urban planning, despite their best intentions, there are powerful corporate and political interests that shape what you can and can't do. So all of your most utopian or progressive imaginings might come up against a very hard wall of corporate interests and political pressure. So I do take that in mind as I kind of suggest these sort of provocations to architects and designers, that I don't think that every problem is yours to fix or is your fault. But I think that people can maybe take my remarks as sort of suggestions, starting points, ways of thinking, rather than as a blueprint or a set of prescriptions for how one should do their work. But we all, I think, can recognize that however we're trained, whatever our schooling, our education, our professional training is, we are kind of shaped very much by the past, shaped by what has been the norm, shaped by what has been the accepted wisdom or the common sense of our fields. And as we step into those roles, we can start to question some of that common sense, some of that received wisdom, and think about possibilities in a different way. So that's sort of how I see my role today as part of these conversations, which once again, I will just say I'm very grateful to be invited to be a part of. So what I thought I would talk about today, because we still find ourselves very much in the midst of this global pandemic. Of course, this book was written before the pandemic was an inkling in the imagination of most of us. So it's been very interesting to have conversations about the book in a time when many people are thinking differently about the spaces around us, everything from just our home spaces that we find ourselves in, the sort of the rooms and bedrooms that you may be sitting in right now listening to this talk, and the cities around us, our public spaces and so on. So it's been a really generative time to have these conversations. And I think a lot of people have been thinking about things that they maybe weren't very visible to them in their sort of normal pre-pandemic day-to-day lives. So a couple of central questions. what has the pandemic revealed about the place of care work in cities? And by care work, I really use this as an umbrella term to describe all of the both paid and unpaid. And by paid, we also mean usually underpaid, like not very well paid, mostly work that is done to sort of keep us all alive. So of course, it's everything from the care work we do in the home to look after families, children, ourselves, elderly people, people in our communities, to the paid work that is done by a mostly feminized and often racialized workforce to feed people, to work in transit and sanitation, healthcare, and other sorts of essential services. So what has the pandemic revealed to us about how this kind of work is prioritized in cities? And as we think about that question, we might start to imagine a set of different assumptions that we could start from when we're thinking about the cities and the buildings around us. So I thought that to start it with, I would just share 4 headlines that have come over the past few months that kind of maybe remind us of some of the both gender dimensions of this pandemic and questions about care work. So I'll just go through these and then tell you a bit about what I make of them. So here's one from October. This is referring to the United States. COVID-19 is forcing women out of the workplace in record numbers, and we don't know when they'll be back. So in this situation, women are being forced out of the workplace in part because many of the sectors that women typically work in have been shut down or very limited by the pandemic. So retail, service work, food services, and so on have really hit women hard. So many women have lost their jobs or have seen their work cut back. But the other part of this is that women have been overburdened with the responsibility of care work, especially in the home, and have found that they cannot juggle their full-time unpaid care work with full-time or even part-time paid work. So this is an ongoing problem. And in the US, it's estimated that this is hundreds of thousands of women. And I think this is being duplicated probably in many countries around the world. This is a headline from Canada, from Ontario, the province where I used to live, from back in September when children were going back to school. That's when school starts up in Canada. Her kid had a stuffy nose. Now hers is one of many Ontario families in COVID testing limbo. So this refers to the situation where, kids go back to school, they have a runny nose, which kids always have a runny nose, right? Pretty much 365 days of the year, but they were being sent home from school. But what's interesting here is her kid, right? Her family. And I think we saw that in all of these cases of these stories, it was women who were expected to stay home from work while they waited for their child's COVID test to come back negative so the kids could go back to school. So this is just another one of those ways in which women's employment has been kind of seen to be like secondary or disposable in certain ways. This one is from BuzzFeed News in September, talking about the gender division of household labor in the home and the ways in which the already uneven gender divide in heterosexual households has been made worse during the pandemic in many cases, that men are still not doing their fair share of work in the home, looking after children, cooking, helping with the homeschooling, cleaning, all of the domestic maintenance work that just keeps us, again, alive and healthy. So it's a reminder that there's still a long way to go in terms of equality in the home. And the last one, this is from Toronto, which is where I lived for most of my life before moving to a small town to work at the university here. And this is about people using the public transportation system, and the organization that runs transport in Toronto, the Toronto Transit Commission, just says, yeah, physical distancing is just not going to be possible on some routes. And the image here of a Black man riding the bus in Toronto is also illustrative, because most of the neighborhoods where people are riding these overcrowded routes are poorer neighborhoods. They are racial minority neighborhoods. And many people in these neighborhoods work in those essential services. They don't have the choice to work from home. They can't just sit behind a computer. They are doing that essential work, again, that is keeping us all alive. Yet they have to put themselves at risk every day to ride overcrowded transit routes. So again, a question about, who does this care work in our economies, and how do we value them and take care of them? And indeed, even here in Canada, which many people kind of imagine as a very equal, multicultural, fair place, the neighborhoods where there have been the highest numbers of COVID cases have been low-income racial minority neighborhoods in our biggest cities. So what do I make of this situation from these 4 headlines? Well, again, a reminder of the very different and unequal effects of the pandemic on different groups of people. And I think it reminds us that in many ways, care work, again, both the work done in the home and the work done for money in the public sphere, are not really considered to be high priorities in urban planning. And they haven't even really been prioritized within COVID. So the crisis has really illustrated for many of us, again, in many different national contexts, that the social safety nets that we have are really full of holes. So things like a lack of national childcare systems, inequitable access to healthcare, the care of elderly people has been especially problematic. In many countries, elderly people in care homes have been the worst hit by the pandemic. That's certainly been the case in Canada, where most of our deaths have been of our elders. Care work has in many ways remained hidden. We haven't really wanted to have national conversations about who does this work. We've been very content to keep it hidden in the home, to keep it on the shoulders of women and others who are believed to, it's our natural role to do this work. I think it's been illustrated that we really do rely on unpaid and underpaid work to keep society functioning. But again, so much of this work is invisible and very much undervalued. We don't want to see it as essential work until, clearly a pandemic comes and reminds us that we need to do that. So then when we look at this from like an urban perspective, from a design perspective, I think we can see that in many ways, care work, just caring for other human beings, is very much an afterthought in design. It's not at the front of mind when we're thinking about how we're shaping the cities around us. And a kind of a broader question that I think emerges from this is around our sense of collective responsibility to one another. So have we created societies and spaces, communities, neighborhoods, environments where we can feel connected to our neighbors, to our fellow citizens, to the people around us? Or have we been creating environments where we see each other as a threat and an enemy? And in many ways, I think the question that has emerged in many countries about whether you should wear a mask or not is illustrative of this, right? A mask is a very minimal way of showing I have a sense of responsibility towards you. I care for you. I don't want to make you sick. I see us as in this together. But the refusal of many people to do that, and of governments even to say that it's good and necessary, I think is a reminder that there has been this kind of breakdown, that we have not been encouraged to see each other as community, right? As part of the same community, but we've been encouraged to see each other as threats and enemies. But of course, COVID did not create these problems. Care has long been an afterthought in cities. It's just taken a pandemic to kind of make this visible to many people for whom the current status quo has really worked quite well. They haven't felt any need to question why things are the way they are, because they benefit from it for the most part. So to kind of sum up what some of these aspects of the crisis are, Care work has remained, and I say deliberately, because I do think that it serves, again, the status quo quite well, to keep care work hidden and invisible within the private family home. We know that men still do not do a full share of childcare and housework. That public care work, so the work that people do for waged labor, has been underpaid, undervalued, and even stigmatized, right? It's seen as a lesser form of work, right? Not seen as a very skilled, professional, valuable labor in society. And so it has fallen to the most marginalized groups, to recent immigrants, to youth, to refugees, to people who are kind of on the margins of society to do this work. And assumptions about who does care work really run rampant in policymaking in every sector. So I think it wasn't until, again, speaking from the Canadian context at least, that there was kind of an outcry from women about all of the extra work that they were doing, that government sort of even started to think, oh yeah, when we shut down schools, like somebody has to take care of children, but many women work in essential services, so how is that going to work, right? There was like oh, right, we haven't even really thought about how this is all going to come together, right? About how it's even going to be possible for families to take on this extra work. And again, coming back to a kind of a city focus, public space has not really been considered part of the care work picture. We don't really see public space as perhaps part of the solution to this problem of care work remaining hidden, of it being unequally put on women's shoulders and unequally put on the shoulders of marginalized people to do. So that's something we could think about. Could we, what role can public space play here? So what are some of the questions that we can ask? We need to be asking, are our cities, homes, buildings really built to carry us through a crisis, right? Is this even part of the imagining or the vision behind our environments, and will it be going forward into the future? Questions about who and what are we relying on? So again, whose labor, whose time, whose energy have we as a society just been relying on without acknowledging it, without caring about it, without paying for it? What assumptions underpin these systems? Again, assumptions about who does care work and where it happens. What values are informing our design? So what have cities really seen as the most valuable functions, the most valuable people, the most important priorities? And it's pretty clear, at least to me, that care work has not been at the top of that list. So then for folks who are interested in architecture and design in cities, what can design do, right? Can design contribute to the solution? And in what ways has design been part of the problem, right? Is there a role there to play? And obviously, I think the answer is yes. So as we think about trying to answer these questions or even move forward with some kind of vision, we also have to kind of be conscious, I guess, of the kind of the middle three questions here. What are we relying on? What assumptions are underpinning these systems, and what values are informing us? And begin to take on the role of, as I said at the beginning, kind of questioning some of the common sense that has been kind of passed down to us as how cities should be set up, how they should function, what their priorities should be. So as a good feminist, we love to question binaries, right? Things that are placed as opposites to one another, like the gender binary, or even the idea that it is a binary. We love to question those things. We love to kind of either turn them on their heads or to try to explode them a bit. So I thought I would just share a few binaries that you might see kind of lurking within fields like design and architecture as well. And I'm not going to go through all of these in detail. I just put them up here as things that we might think about. Why do we assume that these things exist as opposites to one another, or that they are distinct in some way? And how does that, setting them up as a binary, how does that again kind of uphold a certain status quo, a certain set of norms? So public-private. This is obviously a huge one that feminists have long been thinking about in all sorts of contexts, but it's also clearly an important one for people interested in cities to think about, right? What spaces are public and which are private, and what functions of society happen in these spaces? And why are they divided in the way that they are? Why do some things happen in private and some things in public, right? And are there different ways to imagine kind of mixing that up? Why is the nuclear family seen as the sort of primary unit of care in society? Why are other relations like friends, extended family, colleagues, community members not seen as part of that care network? Questions about home and work, right? The assumption that home and work are two separate places. So this is a good example of how, in many ways, the pandemic has already started to shake up many of these binaries. It's already started to kind of explode them or collapse them into one another. So for many people, home and work have now become the same space. And it's maybe raising questions about what are the limitations of this space that we call the home, right? Can it really accomplish all of the functions that we're asking it to accomplish right now? Can it be a workspace? Can it be a school? Can it be a space of care? Can it be a space of relaxation? Can it be a space of recovery in terms of health and illness? Is it really set up to work in that way? I think many of us have found that it's not in many ways set up to do all of those things. So COVID is maybe a moment for that's really offers us an opportunity to kind of blow up or explode or at least question some of these binaries and the way that we have maybe taken them for granted as we think about the spaces around us and social relations. So what does it mean then to envision a more feminist city? And I say more because I don't imagine that there is like a perfect feminist utopia out there, but I imagine it as kind of a process of a set of values and principles that we could imagine. So what are some of those principles? We could think about increasing the equality of access to public space. We know that public space can be very exclusive despite its name. Not all publics are equally welcome in most spaces. And in many ways, public spaces can be quite dangerous or unsafe for certain groups of people. So in the context of a pandemic, where outdoor public space is an important way to be, to socialize, to do different sorts of things, how can we ensure that there is equality of access? How might we reimagine the home and the family? This is another principle, thinking about the way in which the traditional single family home and its unit of the heterosexual nuclear family has been very limited and problematic in all sorts of ways, from the levels of domestic violence that happen in the home to the gender division of labor there. So a feminist city to me is also about reimagining this seemingly basic unit. I also want to think about how we can build care into city infrastructure as a forethought. So not as something that we worry about later after the more important stuff of the economy has been taken care of, but what if we think about caring for other human beings as the most essential function of a city? What would that look like? And finally, as part of that, how do we value care work as the foundation of the economy? In many places in the context of the pandemic, we've been told to worry about the economy. We have to save the economy. The economy is suffering, as if it's this thing that just exists outside of the human beings that make it function, right? So instead of seeing, care work and the home and the family over here and the economy over here, recognizing that care work is the economy. If you don't have care work, you don't have the economy, right? If you don't have healthy, secure, safe, cared for human beings, you do not have the economy, right? But we kind of have that backwards. We think that if the economy is okay, then people will be okay. But really, I think it's the other way around. So those are some of the principles that we could think about. So I want to just go through like 3 ideas There are lots of different realms of intervention that we could imagine, but I'll just talk about three as we kind of move into the last bit of my talk here today. And I think these are three areas that are kind of important and normal areas of intervention for people like planners, for example, and designers. So one of them is around mobility. And I think in many cities, what has typically been prioritized in terms of mobility is how we get from home to work and back again at certain times of the day. So again, the economy, the paid economy. But other types of mobility, other needs for mobility have rarely been seen as central or important. And this shows up in a whole variety of ways. It shows up in terms of accessibility, right? So who can access city sidewalks, public transportation systems, even just, moving about the city, moving through public space. Can you do that with a wheelchair, with a stroller, as an elderly person, right? How accessible is public space? We also think about the fact that, decades of research have shown, for example, that women's journeys to and from work are not linear journeys. There's often stops to take children somewhere, to run errands, to pick up diapers, to get the groceries, to check on elderly parents, to do care work, to do volunteer work. So care work really doesn't fit neatly into that linear, journey from home to work and back. Care work requires different sorts of networks. It requires buses to run into suburban areas at different times of the day. It requires affordability for different groups of people. It means not being punished for getting on and off your route multiple times. It means not charging extra money for children and babies to be on public transportation. So mobility is, to me, a part of this vision of a city that prioritizes care work, right? We have to expand the realm of things that we imagine mobility to be important for. Connected to that is very much questions of accessibility. And I keep making this very basic statement in these talks, like people have bodies, but this is something that, again, is kind of an afterthought in a lot of design and architecture. I know nobody goes to architecture school to think about designing a really great bathroom, but these are the things that actually make cities livable, right? We need places to go to the bathroom, and we need bathrooms that are physically accessible and safe and that match your gender identity or that are not gendered. We need spaces to sit, to rest, to look after children. We need shade and water and food and shelter. These are very basic human needs, and yet they are often not prioritized in the design of our public spaces or our buildings. There's something that you worry about later, right? The embodied nature of life is seen as something to think about at a later date. But what if we put that at the front? What if we said we're going to think about accessibility? We're going to think about what human bodies need from the spaces around them. And we're going to start from that place and then see what emerges, right? So people have bodies, always good to remember. The third thing that I think we could take this moment to really push for is just the idea of having multifunctional public spaces. So as I said earlier, public space has not really been imagined as a space of care work for the most part. It's either kind of institutional public space, it's the streets, or it's really privatized public space. So places like cafes and restaurants or corporate owned public spaces. But what if we could imagine using our public spaces for all different sorts of care work and social reproduction work? So if our public spaces were classrooms where children would learn, if our public spaces were public kitchens, communal kitchens where people could make food together, provide food for those in need, or simply just eat together. And again, I think the pandemic is an interesting moment for this because we are being encouraged to be outdoors, even in the winter here in Canada, but we haven't really had urban spaces that are set up to support that kind of socializing. So we're seeing all of this kind of move to like have restaurants have more outdoor space, and I get that, but who else gets the right to those sidewalks, right? Who else can access those spaces, right? The right to sit in a warmed bubble eating my risotto on the street is really maybe not the highest priority. What if we could imagine using those spaces for something other than, paid consumption? So this is a great time to ask, what sorts of multifunctional spaces could we push for as we move out of crisis and into hopefully something different? So I do think that planners, urbanists, placemakers, geographers, architects can play a role in creating space for care. Again, I recognize that no one is sort of all powerful in this, but starting from some of these different assumptions might be a good way to go. So some of the first steps that people who are interested in this work could take, one would be recognizing what already exists. So of course, there are many community groups and individuals who are already doing a lot of this work in their communities, who have already set up networks of care, who are already trying to make care work public and collective and so on. So we have to know what already exists and find ways to support that. We have to make it intersectional. So we have to recognize that the solution that works for one group of people might not work for another group. And to me, this is complicated, it is messy, but if we kind of start from thinking about what are the needs of the most vulnerable, right? What would make a low-income disabled woman feel safe and comfortable in this space? What would be accessible and welcoming to queer youth? If we start from those kinds of questions, then I think the benefits kind of trickle up to those of us who might have more privilege. Care networks, not care boxes. So the home is kind of a care box, right? Where we box care work into this sort of individualized unit. But I think we have to start imagining care as a much wider network than that. So it's not just about, can women do more of this work, or even can we make individual men do more of this work, but how can we as a society share this work and value it? So part of that might be being a bit radical and kind of blowing up the home and the family as we know it, and thinking about different ways of living together, different housing arrangements, different even legal and care arrangements that could involve friends, for example, or more distant family members. Doesn't always have to be predicated on intimate romantic relationships, right? There are other ways of imagining being in relationship, being in family with other people. And finally, always thinking about giving communities control. So recognizing again that in different neighborhoods, in different cities, in different parts of the world, different sorts of solutions will make sense. So there's not a one size fits all approach. And often communities and people already know what they need and what they want. We just have to listen. So in many ways, there's kind of nothing new here, but what I've observed over the past several months is that the COVID crisis seems to have led many people to like the first time discovery of problems like domestic violence, unpaid care work, an unequal gender division of labor, and underpaid service work. But now that more people are aware and interested in talking about it, we can't go back to normal. We can't just reproduce the status quo in a kind of post-pandemic city. So as we think about imagining the next step, part of it, as I've said, is questioning that common sense of our cities, questioning what we've always taken for granted about what is normal and right and good in our cities, and saying, there might be some ways that we could really turn this upside down. So as I've suggested, one of the ways we can do that is to think about, what does it look like to put care work center, to put human needs at the center? And if we start from there, what different sorts of spaces actually can emerge from that? Okay, thank you. That is the end of my talk.
Thank you. I'm going to move on to questions, but I have like a few anecdotes myself. Well, as architects, we often believe it's our motto that form follows function, obviously. So while design currently follows systemic injustice, right? So it's like the chicken and the egg problem. Do we change the system from within and then design will follow accordingly, or would the system have to follow design? I understand your position, but it's still frustrating to see how that could happen. I mean, what we have here, like for example, last week we had an elderly professor, and she said, because we have a lot of motorcycles, because we have a lot of like shipments and food ordering and stuff, she said when she asked for space from motorcycle riders or people bumping into her, they told her to stay home. I mean, that's the first thing we have to change, I feel like. I see a few faces laughing. I don't know how to pose this as a question. It's more like a thought that bothers me, I guess.
Yeah, I can understand that frustration, and it might be that other people listening have their own thoughts and ideas about this. And yeah, I mean, I'm under no illusions that there is a sort of like a perfect building or design that's going to solve all of these problems. But I think, what does it look like to design space with inclusion as the primary value, right? What would that mean for how your designs come to be, right? So if the form has to follow the function, if one of the functions or the primary goals is for space to be inclusive, does that change anything, right? Does that reshape the things that you consider to be, the most important elements of the design, as opposed to the things that, oh, we don't have any money for that, so that gets cut out of the design, or that would be really nice to have, but actually, we're not going to prioritize that, right? But if inclusion was like the top priority, what would that mean, right? Or if spaces for care were at the top priority rather than spaces to make money, what would that look like? Could we even, and I'm not naive about, that we need businesses, for example, until we get rid of capitalism, I guess, entirely. But until that time, we need this mix. But are there ways to think about how these spaces could be mixed? And again, this is sort of an interesting moment when we think about like the traditional workplace, like the office building or the office tower. These might be places that we don't use as much in the future. Maybe many people will stay home and work from home more than they ever used to, or only be in workplaces part-time. So how could we use those spaces in different ways? Could we have childcare? Could we have classrooms? Could we have communal cooking spaces, right? Could we imagine our workplaces as integrating some of those functions that have traditionally been seen as only appropriate for the home? So again, it's kind of a moment where we might be able to propose or imagine that in some way.
Yeah, like make use of this weird time, I guess. It's kind of exciting when you put it that way.
Yeah.
Okay. Do we have questions? I'm just gonna let anybody unmute themselves and go ahead. Okay, we have one, I guess.
Hi, Leslie. Thank you so much for this wonderful talk. Well, I liked really the idea of defining the community in terms of redefining the community with the ideas of not just inclusivity, but also social justice. And I think that's a good principle to start to apply to the design sector, right? So who are the users and what are their needs, but think about the variety of uses as well. And I read your Feminist City book this summer with interest. But I was thinking also, now that I'm in New York, and thinking about the multiple uses of public spaces or sort of temporary uses of public spaces. Remember this summer, they opened up certain hospitals in Central Park, I think by an NGO called Good Samaritans. But then what happened is Good Samaritans refused to take care of the LGBTQE community. So I guess what I'm trying to say, it's not just about sort of urban planning or architecture, but we need policy to support these new ideas and inclusive matters. So if you could comment on that, that would be great. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that example. And I 100% agree with you that this has to also be supported through policy and supported through, government intervention, supported through money flowing towards it, because I think in so many places we have been content to leave a lot of the work of care, especially crisis care, to nonprofit organizations. So that might be like domestic violence shelters, right? These are nonprofit organizations, but they're not, they're government funded, but they're not the government, right? The state, at least here in Canada and the US. Food banks, right? Shelters being run by religious organizations, for example. And this does raise questions about inclusion. It does raise questions about who has access to these spaces. So I think we do have to question what we have kind of siphoned off to the charity sector that really are in fact essential needs in our communities, and say, why have we decided that it's volunteers essentially who provide this labor as opposed to the system itself? So I think those are great questions to ask at this time.
Hi, Professor Kern. Thank you for your talk. While you were speaking, I was actually just constantly thinking about the problems we face, especially in Istanbul, where we try to find a park just to hang out in during COVID, because it's been very much every small lot has been just left to construction, or without consuming anything, we haven't been able to hang out, which is a big problem, especially with COVID, that now we can't go anywhere indoors. And I was thinking actually the ways that small communities create public spaces on their own, because I find that whenever I hang out with friends, we don't have anywhere to go, so we find a bench or something to kind of transform it to our own space. So I was thinking your thoughts on that, whether these marginalized communities, or even just someone who doesn't want to participate in any kind of consumption kind of activity, what do you think they do, or how much of that influences design in a way?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's definitely, again, something I've noticed here in Canada, this question of, our public spaces have become cafes and other consumption spaces. There's still a cost of admission to them. And many of our public spaces have not been even set up to be comfortable for socializing. There's a bench way over there and there's a bench way over there, but you can't sit two groups of people and have a conversation between them, right? Or they're made to be deliberately uncomfortable, so homeless people won't sleep there or stay for a long time. There's nowhere to get water. There's nowhere to go to the bathroom. So how do you hang out in a park for a few hours if you can't go to the bathroom, right? So very basic sorts of questions. So the question then of what about communities kind of taking this upon themselves? I mean, to the extent that that is possible, I think that can be a great solution. I mean, we see that when communities take over vacant lots to make a garden, for example, right? Or to create some kind of play area for children. So it can happen. And in some ways it might be preferable at least to have community input, because often what we see, for example, is that designers, architects, planners, they'll build a space and they think it's going to be really great for the community, and then nobody uses it. And they're like, well, why is nobody using it? And they find out later that there's, different needs or different desires that they never took into consideration. So I think imagining that as both I totally support people finding ways to like take urban space and use it in their own way, right? Creating their own pockets of space. But for those who may have some influence in the design realm, like really listening to what people want and what will be useful for them so that we don't end up with, again, these like swaths of urban space that are just unusable for many people.
Thank you.
Thanks.
I remember in the beginning of the pandemic, there were a lot of speculation about what would happen to public space, whether we would not use it ever again. And this past summer, me and my friends, obviously we had nowhere to go, so we would meet in these like seaside parks. We don't have a lot of green space in Turkey. You might remember the political events of a few years back. So what we did is just like use the parks, whatever green space we could find, but they're not completely usable. So, I mean, I see what you mean completely, but when the pandemic started, it was completely different what people thought. And now it's going to be regenerated in a way that's, I don't know the word, actually, I can't come up with the word, but it's going to be very different, I feel like.
Yeah, I think I've heard this from a lot of people that there has been a real, people have really noticed the lack of natural spaces, natural environment in many cities, or they've really felt a need to be able to be out in nature more, but there have been, you know, again, limitations and exclusions on who can do that, whether that's because, you know, you're a Black person and someone calls the police on you for being in Central Park, for example, which we saw earlier this year, or whether it's because there's, yeah, again, nowhere to go to the bathroom, right? Like, can you take your children on like a 3-hour, you know, trip to a beautiful park, but there's no bathrooms, right? Something like these really seemingly basic things that seem to have been forgotten. So I think it will be interesting to see whether this does result in some increased interest in what kinds of like nature we need access to.
Do we have any other questions?
Yeah, we have.
Çağatay lütfen.
Okay. Thank you very much for the presentation, and thank you, Deniz, for this opportunity to meet with Leslie Kern. I cannot imagine that. There's one question, private, and I will ask something else if we have time afterwards. It says that how do you think about the citizens of the city, actually? The reappearing dolphins in the Venice, and the regenerating natural life in the city space, actually. Maybe this needs more than a total approach, not just the division of genders. I think that this is about that. And what do you think about that whole Anthropocene kind of looking through this use of city, the change in the use of the city? I think it's about that.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think it's an interesting time to think about what we might call like the more than human or the non-human, like what are our relationships with non-human animals and how important those are, right? Even seeing so many people like adopt new pets during the pandemic, or really relying on the animals in their lives for like their mental well-being, right? And how important that has been for so many people. It does, again, create a moment for us to all recognize the importance of the more than human world as part of our relations, right? As part of our community, as not something that is totally separate from the city. And again, in many cases, the natural environment has been sort of seen as a secondary priority in cities. So maybe this is a moment where we can shift our thinking around that as well. Yeah, I'm not sure if that quite got at your question, but those are just some of the thoughts that I have about it. Yeah.
I really like how you have depended on care ethics to narrate the whole thing, because it was opening up so much new fields to discuss. Because I think, like, as far as I'm concerned, the current crisis have led into significant damage beyond care work as well. Like the entertainment sectors, for instance, where like a significant proportion of trans and non-binary folks depend as an income, was like totally shut down without any explanations. This was, for instance, a massive blow to minorities and other vulnerable groups. This was one, for instance. Another thing is, like, the current crisis also found new ways to violate certain groups that it kept under oppression anyway. Like one of those being the sex workers, for instance, in Istanbul, a specific street where sex workers hold houses and work was under police crackdown. The whole street was shut down. This was something we have never seen before, a street itself being shut down and the houses being evacuated. So these people not only depended to these spaces for work, but also as housing. And like they were evicted without any explanation. And like from the start, they were never offered an exit option anyway. So this was also very strange. And like this also, I think, creates a new field where we think beyond care work, but inside care ethics, I suppose. I was just gonna ask, what are other things that fall outside of care work, but also still got affected in a feminist perspective to think in general, because like care work represents a significant proportion of this maybe, but maybe not the totality of the issue.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. That's very true. And the examples that you give are really important ones. And I think we've seen similar things happening here as well. I mean, I think there's, as much as I've tried to offer some like optimistic, like, oh, imagine we could do this, the crisis could open up this opportunity. We also know that crisis is a time when power gets consolidated, right? When as you're pointing out, pre-existing sorts of exclusions and power relations can really get like solidified or even exacerbated as powerful groups use a moment of crisis to advance other sorts of agendas. And I think that is probably very much going to happen. So, I mean, another area, housing, kind of like you mentioned, that's another huge area of discussion, and probably one that I anticipated talking more about, it then kind of got shifted to talking a lot about care work in the pandemic, but housing is a big concern too. I mean, as I said earlier, I'm a gentrification researcher, so normally I spend a lot of time thinking about housing, and it's been interesting how, in the pandemic at the beginning, it was like, oh, okay, we won't evict people, there'll be rent relief, blah, blah, blah. And then a few months in, it's like that never happened, right? It's kind of back to business as usual, or back to an even harsher kind of crackdown. And that, again, happening here in Canada, where, again, everything is supposed to be so good and equal, but lots of people facing evictions and homelessness and all of this kind of thing. So I think just to, I guess, name one area in response to your question, I would say housing would be another huge issue to look at for many of our cities.
Do we have time? May I ask my question?
I think we do.
Okay. Actually, I don't want to open up a discussion of binary issues and modernity, some kind of, but I was just trying to get used to the chaos of that home and work things mixing together. And I want you to open up your ideas about that. Maybe the societies facing the chaos of that men and women spaces mixing together. I see the similarity you presented in your presentation, actually, and I want your opinion about that more.
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, I think the pandemic has shown a lot of the strains that have long existed in the single family home and the traditional nuclear family. Again, it's nothing new, right? These strains and these inequalities have long been there, and feminists and others have been talking about it for a very, very, very long time. But it's only been, or this has been a kind of a renewed moment for paying attention to all of that labor. So in thinking about this in the context of this theme of the feminist city, what does this have to do with cities? This is a social problem, yes, but it is also a spatial problem in that so much of what we have designed as housing is, especially in North America, it's very, it's very nuclear family, like even extended family, grandparents, like that's not included is the norm in our housing forms, right? And the more private that form of housing can be, the better. So the kind of lack of like communal spaces, the lack of even imagining what those communal spaces or shared care labor would look like has meant that, we are very boxed into these ways of being, and it's very hard to do something different when that is the space that you have. So, but there are alternatives, right? There are co-housing developments where many families live, but they share communal space like kitchen and play areas for children and things like that. There are, the examples of like homes for the elderly, but where also like students live, so that there's this kind of multi-generational interaction, which I think is so great because again, the pandemic has really shown that care homes for the elderly have been such dangerous places, and we've really, in many societies at least, wanted to forget about senior citizens. We wanted to push them, out of sight, out of mind, and not spend money on their care and all of this kind of stuff, and it's been devastating. So I think if we can, again, kind of blow up the home a little bit and think about other ways of being, which isn't to say we would totally get rid of the single family home. Lots of people like it, it's fine, but there are so few alternatives that it locks many of us into ways of being and in family forms that don't really work for us in today's times.
Yeah, thank you. I asked it because you used that traditional home idea, but it's not so traditional here in Turkey, actually. So that traditional seems kind of modern to us. That's why I asked this question. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
May I ask one question? Thank you for your presentation, Leslie. I would like to go a little back in your introduction when you were introducing yourself. What makes me think of when you were stressing the word privilege? Regarding that, I would like to ask that how possible it is for us to learn the privilege of what we have and what others not. So I would like to ask about this. Thank you.
Thanks. It's a great question. I mean, I guess I'll just speak from my own experience rather than trying to, sort of tell other people how to grapple with that. But I guess one thing that I thought about in writing the book was that, the idea of a feminicity is not just to take the image of the standard urban citizen, a white, able-bodied cisgender man, and replace it with pretty much the same figure but a woman, right? That is not really going to get us very far. It would change some things, but it's not truly the inclusive vision that I wanted to think of. So for me, part of that was given that I, in many ways, match that in terms of many of the privileges that I have. So it's not about like just centering me and my needs and thinking, how do I want the city to be? Because in many ways, the privileges that I have, particularly white skin privilege in the context where I live, that is going to perhaps can be kind of weaponized against other people, right? It can be seen as part of processes of exclusion and inequality and ongoing racism and gentrification and everything. So for me, that means part of that, not just unlearning privilege, but being conscious of it is kind of trying to like read very widely, right? Think about who I'm citing, think about whose work I'm reading. And I did that as part of the process of the book, to kind of go through my citations and really look carefully at who I was citing. Are there people of color? Are there people from the global South? Are there queer and trans people? Are there disabled people, in my citational list? Because if there's not, then I'm going to be reproducing a lot of privilege, even unconsciously. And I'm sure there's lots of things that I missed in my book, but those were some of the steps that I tried to take, at least in this particular project, for, if not completely unlearning my privilege, then trying to say that I'm aware of it. And these are the things that I'm trying to do to broaden the perspective. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for being here and for your questions. It's been really fun to talk with you.
Well, thank you for talking with us. It's been very insightful.
I'm glad to hear that. Thank you.
Should I?